If the Supreme Court dismantles the Voting Rights Act, which they appear poised to do, we're not talking about history. We're talking about rights Black Americans could lose in our lifetime. People think this is about politics. No, this is about power and who gets to have it. Imagine waking up on election day and finding out your polling place is gone. Not moved around the corner, not relocated with clear notice, just gone. By the time you figure out where you're supposed to go, the line is wrapped around the block, the sun is dropping, and your shift at work is creeping up behind you. You're technically still allowed to vote, but access and permission aren't the same thing. That gap between what's legal on paper and what's livable in reality is exactly where the Voting Rights Act used to stand guard. When I talk about the Voting Rights Act, I'm not talking about a dry piece of legislation collecting dust in a textbook. I'm talking about a line. On one side of that line, Black people could be blocked from voting with Jim Crow tactics, tricks, tests, fees, and threats. On the other side of that line, states had to answer for those tricks before they became law. The act wasn't some friendly suggestion. It forced jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination in voting to get federal approval before changing their election rules. That oversight was leverage, not a courtesy. The Voting Rights Act made it harder for states and counties to quietly move polling locations out of Black neighborhoods, suddenly demand documents they knew people didn't have, or purge voters from the rolls under the excuse of cleaning up the system. It didn't end racism, but it made discrimination more expensive, slower, and just a little more difficult. It dragged what used to happen in the shadows into a space where someone could say, "No, you can't do that," before the damage was done. You can measure its impact in more than speeches and anniversaries. After the act, Black voter registration in places that had been locked down for generations climbed. Black turnout rose. Black representation in local and federal offices increased. School boards, city councils, state legislatures, congressional seats, the map started to change because more Black people could actually get to the ballot and have that ballot counted. This helped pave the way for representation in spaces that advanced our progress. The system didn't become fair, but the gap between what we were allowed to do and what we could realistically do narrowed. That's why any conversation about eliminating or hollowing out the Voting Rights Act isn't theoretical to me. It's not about one line in a law. It's about erasing that hard-fought distance between participation and permission and pushing us back toward a country where the right to vote technically exists, but protection of that right does not. But when you think about it, has America ever honored the right of Black Americans to vote? Before the Voting Rights Act, the tools were blunt and shameless. Literacy tests that had nothing to do with reading. You could be a Black teacher and still be failed by a white registrar who decided you didn't sound right. Poll taxes forced people to choose between groceries and the ballot box. Grandfather clauses that said, in plain language, if your grandfather couldn't vote, you probably couldn't either. Those weren't accidents. They were code-written obstacles designed to look orderly while locking us out. Violence and intimidation sat on top of those rules like security systems. Sheriffs, deputies, local citizens' councils, and mobs made it clear that trying to register to vote could cost you your life. The state didn't always have to swing the fist. It just had to stand back and pretend it couldn't see who did. That's what I mean when I say racism was deputized. Officials could claim the law was neutral, while enforcement made sure it never felt neutral to us. The Dixiecrat era baked this into the bones of local and state politics. Segregation wasn't just about schools and buses. It was also about ballot access. Who could register? Who could stay registered? Whose names mysteriously went missing? Whose district lines were drawn to dilute Black populations so thoroughly that even when we managed to vote, Our impact was scattered across maps like crumbs. There was nothing fair about it. It was administrative racism, and when federal pressure finally forced some change, the media often framed the old tactics as tradition and state control. We were told these were just local customs, regional quirks, defenders of order. The language was always soft, but the effect was always hard. Violence didn't end when national attention moved on. It adjusted. The rope became a form. The gun became a registration test. The burning cross became a locked courthouse door on registration day. When you hear today's conversations about election integrity, local control, and cleaning up the rolls, understand that none of those phrases is new. The vocabulary evolves, but the blueprint is familiar. Keep the law looking neutral while the impact remains anything but. Fast forward to 2013. The Supreme Court decides that the part of the Voting Rights Act that determined which jurisdictions need federal oversight is outdated. Alito and the conservative majority stated that America had changed since the 60s, and with that, the pre-clearance shield was stripped away from the southern states. It was a quiet earthquake. No headline that said, "Protection removed, prepare for impact." But the ground shifted immediately. Southern states, which had long awaited the opportunity to move without federal supervision, didn't waste time. Within days and months, new laws appeared. Strict voter ID requirements, reductions in early voting, changes to same-day registration, purges of the voter rolls labeled as maintenance, and shuffling of polling locations that looked like minor adjustments on paper, but translated into major obstacles for people on the ground. The pattern that followed wasn't random. Areas with significant Black populations often saw more aggressive changes. Long-standing polling places were closed or consolidated, especially in neighborhoods with fewer resources and limited public transportation. The legal language never said Black voters, but the data and the lived experiences did. If you wanted an example of how discrimination can be re-engineered without using the old vocabulary, this was it. This is where the distinction between law and protection really matters. The 15th Amendment already said you can't deny the right to vote on the basis of race. The Voting Rights Act, especially the parts weakened in 2013, was the mechanism to actually enforce that principle. Once that mechanism was weakened, the burden shifted back onto people already carrying the weight. If you wanted to fight a restriction, you had to do it after it passed, after it took effect, after it had already pushed people out of the process. What changed in 2013 was not the idea that discrimination is wrong. What changed was who had to prove it, how long it would take, and how much damage could be done in the meantime. It turned a proactive shield into a reactive struggle. And when people talk now about going even further, about eliminating federal protections entirely, they're talking about taking that quiet, slight rumbling underground and turning it into a landslide. You don't have to imagine what will happen when the Supreme Court eliminates the Voting Rights Act in its entirety. You can look at what's already happening in states that treat the current, weakened framework as a test lab. Take North Carolina. The elections board in one county voted to eliminate an early voting site at North Carolina A&T State University, the largest historically Black public university in the country. That campus site wasn't just a convenience. It was the most accessible way for thousands of Black students and community members to vote early without navigating unreliable transportation or squeezing into election day lines between classes and work. On paper, nobody lost the right to vote. In reality, thousands of people just saw their easiest path to the ballot removed with one vote in a meeting most of them weren't in. Now look at Texas. After new voting rules tightened identification requirements for mail-in ballots, thousands of applications and ballots were rejected in a single primary. The law didn't say, we're targeting Black voters. But the data showed that many of the people tripped up by ID number mismatches and technical errors were not white. For people juggling multiple jobs, health issues, caregiving responsibilities, or long distances to polling locations, mail in voting isn't a luxury. It's the only realistic option. When that option is made more fragile, access shrinks, even though the law claims to treat everyone the same. Georgia tells another part of this story. Long lines in heavily Black precincts, fewer drop boxes than before, new limits on when and how absentee ballots can be returned, and restrictions on something as basic as giving water to voters waiting in hours-long lines. Again, the justification is order, security, and uniform rules. But if you track where the longest lines are, who has fewer resources, and who carries the heaviest load just to stand in those lines, the pattern is familiar. These are not random glitches. They're signals. Removing a campus voting site here, tightening mail-in rules there, restructuring hours and drop boxes somewhere else, each change can be defended as a minor adjustment. But minor adjustments stacked on top of each other become major barriers, especially for Black communities, students, the elderly, disabled people, and working class voters. This is how you test the limits of what you can get away with while the law still technically says everyone is equal. If this is what some states are willing to do now, with parts of the Voting Rights Act still standing, imagine how far they might go if the last pieces of that protection vanish. What we're seeing aren't isolated events. They're trial runs. If the remaining protections of the Voting Rights Act fall, we don't go back to the 1960s overnight. The country doesn't move in reverse that neatly. What happens instead is more dangerous and more subtle. The return of legal exclusion written in the language of compliance and neutrality. Without strong federal oversight, any state or locality that wants to shape its electorate can do it through 1,000 technical choices. How many polling locations they staffed in Black neighborhoods versus white ones? How long does early voting last? What IDs count and what don't? How aggressively they purge voters whose mail is returned or whose addresses change. None of those decisions will say this is about race. They won't have to. In that future, discrimination doesn't wear a white hood. It shows up wearing a business suit, carrying a stack of regulations. It speaks in the tone of administrators and attorneys who say, "We're just following the rules," conveniently forgetting that they wrote those rules in the first place. Suppression becomes compliant. Exclusion comes with a law degree and a press release. Policies will be framed as neutral. These rules apply to everyone, but in practice, they'll press hardest against communities with less time, less transportation, less money, and less margin for error. If you work hourly shifts, a 6-hour line is a wage cut. If you live far from the polling place, a last-minute location change is the difference between voting and staying home. If you move frequently because housing is unstable, a purge notice you never receive can erase you from the rolls without anyone ever having to tell you no directly. Local elections become the quiet battlegrounds. School boards that decide what history gets taught. County commissions that decide where to put resources or close clinics. Judges who interpret every rule. Sheriffs and prosecutors who decide how justice works in real life. When participation in those elections is quietly narrowed, power over everyday life moves further away from the people living it. And there's a domino effect. If a country can accept the rollback of one major protection without serious resistance, it becomes easier to revisit others. If voting protections can be hollowed out, civil rights safeguards can be reinterpreted. Housing protections can be narrowed. Employment discrimination cases can be made harder to win. Bit by bit, the floor that movements fought to build stops being a foundation and becomes a ceiling we're told we should be grateful for. The most chilling part of this future is that it will all be presented as normal. Officials will say the system is functioning. The elections are orderly. Everyone who wants to vote can still vote. And on paper, that might look true. But the paper doesn't show the people who gave up after the third time their mail-in ballot was rejected. It doesn't show the students who never learned where their polling place went. It doesn't show the elders who decided their aching knees couldn't handle another 5-hour line for a voice that feels like it doesn't matter. When I talk about all of this, I'm not just talking about ballots and laws. I'm talking about what it does to the mind and the spirit of a people to watch access be granted, then weakened, then slowly revoked again in their own lifetime. Voting for Black Americans has never been just symbolism. It's been survivorship. It has been the difference between having even a slim chance to influence the systems that control our housing, our schools, our healthcare, our policing, and having those systems decide everything about us, with none of us in the room. Every expansion of protection has come with risk and sacrifice. So when the country starts debating whether those protections are still necessary, it isn't a theoretical argument to us. It's a conversation about whether our struggle is considered outdated while the outcomes of that struggle are still unfinished. Over time, restrictions don't just block ballots. It reshapes psychology. If every attempt to participate is met with new obstacles, more confusion, more letters in the mail saying something went wrong with your registration or your ballot, fatigue sets in. Not because people don't care, but because they get tired of fighting systems that seem committed to making every path uphill. The narrative this country loves to repeat is simple. If people don't vote, they must not care. It's a tidy story that keeps the blame on individuals and off institutions. But in places where access is constantly under quiet attack, the more honest reading is harsher. If people don't vote, maybe the system worked exactly as designed. Low turnout in a community that has been strategically exhausted isn't proof of apathy. It's evidence of impact. The cost isn't just political, it's cultural. It shows up in how elders talk to the next generation about what's possible. It shows up in whether kids grow up believing they live in a country that can hear them or a country that only listens when it's convenient. It shows up in whether people still believe that organizing, educating, and paying attention can shift anything, or whether they quietly decide to shrink their expectations down to whatever harm they think they can. I'm not telling you this to promote panic. Panic is loud and short-lived. What we need is something deeper: awareness, memory, and clarity. We need to remember that none of the protections we have were gifts. We need to see current events not as random headlines, but as chapters in a longer pattern. And we need to understand that when laws designed to protect our participation are weakened or threatened, the impact will not be felt evenly. It'll land first and hardest where it has always landed. What's at stake if the Voting Rights Act falls completely is not just a set of legal provisions. It's whether this country chooses once again to make our access to power conditional, fragile, and easily reversed. It's whether future generations of Black people will grow up treating the right to vote as a living tool or a fading memory. You already know this isn't abstract. We feel it in real time, in our neighborhoods, in our families, in our spirits. The air changes before the storm arrives, and we know that feeling. We've been trained to notice when the temperature drops, when the silence grows heavy. But we've also been trained to steady ourselves, to hold on to each other when the winds grow stronger and start to turn. That's the part they never count on: our awareness and our endurance. We've carried generations through storms disguised as systems, and still we build, still we vote, still we dream. We know the air is shifting again. The winds are blowing against us. Now is not the time to second guess what your spirit is whispering to you. Name it, remember it, prepare for it. Because every time they change the weather around us, we remind them. We've always known how to survive the storm and plant again after it passes. If this conversation resonated with you and you're ready to leave America, follow for more commentary about identity, mental peace, and the real cost of staying in places that don't see you.